Hello, everyone. Let me ask you a question to start. At what point does a government's duty to protect its citizens turn into a war against them? The story of COINTELPRO isn't one of simple surveillance. It's the chronicle of a shadow war waged by the Federal Bureau of Investigation against American citizens under the 48-year reign of its director, J. Edgar Hoover. To understand how the FBI came to target figures like Martin Luther King Jr. with such vicious intensity, one must first understand the man and the institution he built in his own image. Hoover's FBI was not merely a law enforcement agency. It was an intelligence service, a moral arbiter, and a political weapon, all fused into one. Its public face was that of the stoic G-man, chasing down gangsters and kidnappers. But behind the curtain of national security, another, far darker machinery was being constructed. The origins of this machinery lie in the post-war paranoia of the Cold War. The first official counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO, was formally initiated in 1956, its stated target being the Communist Party USA, CPUSA. The Bureau, under Hoover's obsessive direction, saw the specter of Moscow behind every labor strike, every peace rally, and every call for social change. The methods developed during this initial phase would become the template for all future operations. These were not tactics of investigation and prosecution. They were tactics of disruption and neutralization. The goal was not to bring communists to trial, but to destroy the party from within. The FBI deployed a vast network of informants, not just to gather information, but to actively sow discord. They perfected the art of snitch jacketing, or falsely labeling loyal members as informants to create paranoia and internal purges. They forged documents, sent anonymous letters, and leaked derogatory information to friendly media contacts to discredit leaders and create public scandal. They instigated conflicts between different leftist factions, fanning the flames of ideological disputes until they erupted into open hostility. The Bureau became a master of psychological warfare, understanding that an organization torn apart by internal suspicion could not function effectively. For years, these tactics were honed in the shadows, aimed at a political party that was already marginalized in American society. The program was a closely guarded secret, known only to a select few within the Bureau's top echelon. Field agents received their orders in memos that were to be read and then immediately destroyed. The paper trail was intentionally minimal, the chain of command deliberately obscured. Hoover understood that what he was doing was, at best, a gross overreach of his authority and, at worst, profoundly illegal. But he was insulated by his immense political power, the secret files he kept on presidents and congressmen, and a carefully cultivated public image as America's indispensable protector. This was the environment, the institutional culture that existed when the civil rights movement began to gain unstoppable momentum in the late 1950s and early 1960s. To Hoover, this new, powerful, and overwhelmingly black-led movement for social justice was not a righteous call for America to live up to its founding ideals. Instead, he saw it through the same distorted lens with which he viewed the CPUSA, as a potential vehicle for communist infiltration and a fundamental threat to the American social order he so fiercely defended. The techniques of division, defamation, and disruption perfected against the communists were now ready to be deployed against a new target: the men and women who were fighting for the very soul of the nation. The pivot was about to be made, and the full, terrifying power of the state's secret police was about to be turned on its own people. The line between protecting the nation and attacking its citizens was about to be erased entirely. The memos that would soon circulate from Hoover's office would no longer speak of the CPUSA, but of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and with the singular and venomous focus of one man who was rapidly becoming the movement's most powerful voice. The war was coming home. The FBI's pivot from targeting the Communist Party to targeting the civil rights movement was not a sudden shift, but a gradual and insidious creep of paranoia. In the Bureau's rigid hierarchical worldview, any movement that challenged the existing power structure was inherently suspect. J. Edgar Hoover and his top deputies, products of a deeply segregated and conservative America, were institutionally incapable of seeing the demand for black liberation as anything other than a subversive plot. Their official rationale, dutifully recorded in now declassified memos, was that the civil rights movement was a prime target for communist infiltration. They genuinely believed, or at least professed to believe, that leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. were either witting agents of Moscow, or at best, useful idiots being manipulated by unseen communist handlers. This justification, however, served as a convenient cover for a deeper, more visceral animosity. The Bureau was deeply hostile to the very idea of black equality. Field office reports from the South are filled with racist language and dismissive attitudes towards the legitimacy of the movement's goals. For Hoover, a man obsessed with social order and conformity, the sight of mass protests, sit-ins and marches was evidence of societal breakdown, not democratic expression. The primary vehicle for the FBI's initial focus was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, and its president, Dr. King. In 1962, the FBI officially designated the SCLC as a target for infiltration, planting informants at every level of the organization. But the Bureau's obsession with King himself went far beyond institutional procedure. It was personal. Hoover developed a profound and venomous hatred for the civil rights leader. He saw King's Nobel Peace Prize not as an honor for a great American, but as a sign of his dangerous international influence. He was infuriated by King's criticism of the FBI for its failure to protect civil rights workers in the South. To Hoover, this was not just a policy disagreement. It was a personal affront to his authority and the integrity of his bureau. This personal vendetta fueled the expansion of COINTELPRO against King. The operation against him was given the codename Decorate, and it was one of the most intensive and invasive surveillance campaigns ever conducted against an American citizen. The first wiretaps on King's home and SCLC office phones were authorized by Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy in 1963. Kennedy's approval was given reluctantly, based on the FBI's insistent claims that one of King's closest advisors, Stanley Levison, was a secret, high-level communist agent. While Levison had been involved with the CPUSA in the past, the FBI's surveillance never produced any evidence that he was exerting communist control over King or the SCLC. But the lack of evidence didn't matter. The wiretaps were in place, and they opened the floodgates. The surveillance quickly expanded from a search for communist influence to a grubby, voyeuristic quest for personal dirt. The FBI began placing bugs, hidden microphones, in King's hotel rooms as he traveled across the country. Agents listened in on his strategy sessions, his private conversations, his moments of doubt and exhaustion, and, most consequentially, his extramarital affairs. The tapes from these hotel bugs, known within the Bureau as the King tapes, became the centerpiece of the FBI's campaign to neutralize him. The goal was no longer to prove he was a communist. It was to destroy his moral authority and remove him as an effective leader. Memos from the period are chillingly explicit about this objective. One 1963 memo from William C. Sullivan, head of the Intelligence Division, to Alan Belmont, one of Hoover's top deputies, stated their purpose was to expose King as a fraud, demagogue, and moral scoundrel. The memo discussed a plan to create a monograph detailing King's alleged communist connections and his personal misconduct, and to discreetly distribute it to government officials, religious leaders, universities, and the press. The Bureau was preparing to weaponize the most intimate details of a man's life to achieve a political objective. They were no longer investigators. They were character assassins. This strategy marked a terrifying new phase of COINTELPRO. It was a clear demonstration that for the FBI, no tactic was off limits. The full weight of the federal government's domestic surveillance apparatus was being brought to bear not on a foreign spy or a violent criminal, but on a minister whose only crime was demanding that his country live up to its own creed. The information gathered from the bugs in King's hotel rooms would soon be used in the most direct and despicable attack of the entire program, a calculated act of psychological warfare designed to break him completely. The FBI's campaign against Martin Luther King Jr. reached its depraved zenith in late 1964. King had just been named Time magazine's Man of the Year, and even more galling to J. Edgar Hoover had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. This international recognition elevated King to a status that Hoover found intolerable. In the director's mind, King was no longer just a domestic agitator. He was a global figure whose influence posed a direct threat to Hoover's vision of America. The Bureau decided it was time to move beyond simple surveillance and embark on a direct psychological assault. The plan was masterminded by William C. Sullivan, the same intelligence division chief who had earlier proposed a monograph to discredit King. The new plan was far more sinister. The Bureau would use the audio tapes of King's extramarital liaisons, gathered from the bugs in his hotel rooms, as the basis for an anonymous package to be sent directly to him. The goal, as stated in internal memos, was to precipitate a self-destruction, to drive a wedge between King and his wife, Coretta Scott King, and to pressure him into declining the Nobel Prize and removing himself from public life. The package was assembled with meticulous care. It contained a selection of the most compromising audio recordings, a compilation of sounds from different hotel rooms intended to leave no doubt as to their authenticity. Accompanying the tape was an anonymous letter, a masterpiece of venomous, manipulative prose, likely drafted by Sullivan himself. The letter was typed on a standard, untraceable machine and written in a rambling, semi-literate style to disguise its origins. It feigned the voice of a disillusioned black supporter, someone who had once believed in King but had been awakened to his supposed hypocrisy. The letter began by addressing King as a filthy, abnormal animal and an evil, abnormal beast. It accused him of being a colossal fraud and an evil, vicious one at that. The text was a torrent of abuse, mixing racist tropes with feigned moral outrage. It called his religious leadership a complete farce and accused him of being sexually psychotic. The letter's authors knew exactly which buttons to push, attacking his intellect, his faith, and his personal life in a relentless barrage. It referenced the audio recordings directly, telling him, "Listen to yourself, you filthy, abnormal animal. You know you are. You are done." But the most chilling part of the letter came at the end. It delivered a clear and unambiguous threat, thinly veiled as a piece of advice. "King, look into your heart. You know you are a complete fraud and a great liability to all of us Negroes. You are done. There is but one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, fraudulent self is bared to the nation." The package, containing both the letter and the tape, was mailed to the SCLC headquarters in Atlanta in November 1964. It was addressed to Dr. King but was opened by his wife, Coretta. She listened to a portion of the tape before realizing its nature and passing the entire package to her husband and his closest aides. The impact on King was profound. He and his inner circle, including Andrew Young and Ralph Abernathy, immediately suspected the FBI was behind it. They recognized the Bureau's hand in the sophisticated surveillance and the calculated cruelty of the attack. King was reportedly deeply shaken, viewing the letter as a clear encouragement to commit suicide. The phrase, "There is but one way out for you," was not subtle. It was a direct attempt by an agency of the United States government to psychologically terrorize a citizen into taking his own life. This act represents the absolute nadir of COINTELPRO's operations. It was not law enforcement. It was not intelligence gathering. It was a state-sanctioned campaign of psychological terror waged against a single individual. The suicide letter, as it came to be known, revealed the depths of Hoover's personal animus and the complete lack of moral or legal restraint within the FBI's intelligence division. They were willing to use any means necessary to neutralize a leader they had deemed an enemy of the state. While the letter failed in its immediate objective, King did not step down, and he accepted his Nobel Prize in Oslo. The episode left a lasting scar. It confirmed King's worst fears about the government's intentions and added an immense personal burden to the already crushing weight of leading the civil rights movement. It was a stark reminder that the forces arrayed against him were not just Southern sheriffs and Klansmen, but the most powerful investigative agency in the country, operating with impunity in the shadows. The FBI's obsession with Dr. King was singular, but he was far from the only target. As the 1960s wore on and the civil rights movement evolved, the Bureau's COINTELPRO operations expanded to encompass a wide array of black activist groups, each categorized and targeted according to the threat level Hoover perceived. While the SCLC was seen as a movement to be discredited through scandal, a new generation of more militant and revolutionary organizations was viewed with far greater alarm. Chief among them was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. The rise of the Panthers in the late 1960s sent shockwaves through the law enforcement establishment. Founded in Oakland, California by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, the BPP's platform was a radical departure from the nonviolent integrationist approach of Dr. King. Their 10-point program called for fundamental changes to American society, including an end to police brutality, employment for black people, decent housing, and exemption from military service. What terrified Hoover most, however, was their open advocacy of armed self-defense. The sight of organized, disciplined black men and women legally carrying firearms while patrolling the police was an incendiary image that the FBI interpreted as a prelude to armed insurrection. In 1968, Hoover declared the Black Panther Party the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. He instructed all 42 FBI field officers to intensify their COINTELPRO actions against the BPP, making their disruption and neutralization the Bureau's #1 counterintelligence priority. The tactics used against the Panthers were a brutal escalation of those used against the SCLC. While the goal with King was character assassination, the goal with the Panthers was outright destruction. The Bureau aimed to dismantle the organization from the inside out and to incite violence against it from the outside. One of the most common and effective tactics was the creation and exacerbation of factionalism. The FBI used informants and forged documents to create suspicion between the national BPP leadership in Oakland and various local chapters across the country. They spread rumors that key leaders were skimming money or collaborating with the police. A particularly insidious operation involved fanning the flames of conflict between the Black Panthers and other black nationalist groups, most notably the U.S. organization led by Ron Karenga in Southern California. FBI agents forged inflammatory cartoons and letters, sending them back and forth between the two groups to create the impression that each was publicly insulting and threatening the other. These agent provocateur actions had deadly consequences. In January 1969, a gun battle erupted between members of the BPP and the US organization on the UCLA campus, leaving 2 Panthers, Bunchy Carter and John Huggins, dead. A subsequent FBI memo from the San Diego field office celebrated the success of their plan, noting that the shooting would likely lead to further retaliations and that the office should continue its efforts to exploit this situation on a continuing basis. The Bureau was not just observing violence, it was actively manufacturing it. Informants were a cornerstone of the anti-Panther program. The FBI recruited hundreds of individuals from within the BPP, often by threatening them with long prison sentences on unrelated charges unless they cooperated. These informants did more than just report on meetings. They were instructed to disrupt activities, sabotage community programs like the Free Breakfast for Children program, and act as provocateurs to encourage illegal acts that would lead to arrests. The most dangerous role for an informant was to provide intelligence for police raids. They supplied floor plans of Panther headquarters, lists of legally registered weapons, and information about the daily routines of BPP members. This information transformed police actions from simple arrests into paramilitary assaults. The FBI shared this intelligence with local police departments, which were often already hostile to the Panthers, knowing it would likely lead to violent confrontations. The Bureau created a self-fulfilling prophecy. By portraying the Panthers as a violent, subversive threat, they instigated the very conditions that would lead to violent crackdowns, which in turn proved their initial assessment. This lethal feedback loop of disinformation, infiltration, and state-sponsored violence would reach its tragic and bloody climax in a pre-dawn raid in Chicago, an event that would expose the truly murderous potential of COINTELPRO. The target was one of the BPP's most charismatic and effective young leaders, a man the FBI saw as a potential Black Messiah who had to be stopped at any cost. The FBI's war against the Black Panther Party reached its most infamous and lethal chapter in the cold, early morning hours of December 4, 1969, in Chicago. The target was Fred Hampton, the 21-year-old chairman of the Illinois BPP. In a short time, Hampton had emerged as one of the most dynamic and promising leaders in the entire movement. He was a brilliant organizer and a powerful orator, but what made him particularly dangerous in the eyes of J. Edgar Hoover was his ability to build coalitions. Hampton was successfully forging alliances not just with other Black nationalist groups, but also with working-class white organizations like the Young Patriots and the Puerto Rican Young Lords. He was creating a multiracial rainbow coalition of the poor and disenfranchised, a realization of the FBI's ultimate fear, a unified front of radical groups capable of challenging the status quo on a mass scale. An internal FBI memo identified Hampton as a key threat precisely because of his leadership and organizing skills. The Bureau determined that he had the potential to become a Black Messiah, a figure who could unify and electrify the masses in the way they feared Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. had. The directive was clear. Hampton had to be neutralized. The key to the operation was an informant named William O'Neill. O'Neill had been recruited by the FBI after being arrested for interstate car theft. Facing serious prison time, he agreed to infiltrate the Chicago BPP. He quickly rose through the ranks, becoming Hampton's personal bodyguard and the chapter's chief of security. He was in a perfect position to execute the Bureau's plans. Under the direction of his FBI handler, Agent Roy Mitchell, O'Neill provided a steady stream of intelligence on the chapter's activities. Most critically, he provided a detailed floor plan of the BPP apartment on West Monroe Street where Hampton and other Panthers lived. He marked the location of beds, furniture, and most importantly, the exact spot where Fred Hampton slept. This floor plan was the operational blueprint for the attack. In the weeks leading up to the raid, the FBI and the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, led by Edward Hanrahan, worked in concert. The official justification for the raid was a search for a stockpile of illegal weapons. O'Neill had reported that the Panthers had weapons in the apartment, though many were legally owned. The raid was planned as a joint operation with 14 heavily armed officers from the state's attorney's office assigned to carry it out at 4:45 a.m. The night before the raid, O'Neill was with Hampton and other Panthers in the apartment. It is widely believed, though never definitively proven in court, that O'Neill drugged Hampton's drink with a powerful barbiturate to ensure he would not wake up during the assault. Hampton returned to the apartment late and fell into a deep sleep. As the police task force assembled, they were armed with the FBI-provided floor plan. They stormed the apartment, and the shootout that the police later described to the press was, in reality, a one-sided massacre. Ballistics evidence later showed that while the police fired nearly 100 rounds into the apartment, only one shot was fired by the Panthers, likely a reflexive spasm from a shotgun held by Mark Clark, who was on security duty and was killed instantly in the opening volley. The rest of the Panthers, many of whom had been asleep, were met with a hail of gunfire. Police officers went directly to Hampton's bedroom, guided by the floor plan. He was asleep in his bed next to his pregnant fiancée, Deborah Johnson, now Akua Njeri. The first volley of shots wounded him. According to Johnson and other survivors, officers then entered the room. One officer was heard saying, "He's still alive." 2 more shots were fired at point-blank range into Hampton's head. He was executed in his sleep. Another Panther, Mark Clark, was also killed, and several others were seriously wounded. In the immediate aftermath, State's Attorney Hanrahan held a press conference, claiming his officers had been met with a vicious attack from the Panthers and had acted in self-defense. He praised their restraint and bravery. The media initially reported the police version of events, but the story quickly unraveled. The BPP and activist lawyers organized their own tours of the apartment, showing reporters the bullet-riddled walls, starkly contradicting the police account. A federal grand jury investigation and subsequent civil rights lawsuit would eventually expose the truth. The raid was an ambush, predicated on false information and executed with lethal intent. William O'Neill's role as the FBI informant who provided the floor plan was revealed, and he was paid a handsome bonus by the Bureau for his valuable assistance. The assassination of Fred Hampton was COINTELPRO at its most brutal and explicit. It was not disruption. It was state-sanctioned murder designed to decapitate the leadership of a political movement. While Martin Luther King Jr. and the Black Panther Party were the primary targets of COINTELPRO's fury, the program's tentacles reached far and wide, ensnaring a vast spectrum of individuals and organizations involved in the struggle for civil rights and social change. The FBI's definition of subversive was incredibly broad, encompassing not just revolutionary Marxists but also nonviolent student organizers, liberal actors, and anyone who dared to fundamentally question American policy at home or abroad. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, one of the most influential and courageous organizations of the civil rights movement, was a major focus of the Bureau's disruptive efforts. Initially, the FBI viewed SNCC through the same lens as the SCLC, as a group to be monitored for communist influence. However, as SNCC's ideology evolved, particularly after Stokely Carmichael, later Kwame Ture, became its chairman in 1966 and popularized the call for Black Power, the Bureau's approach became far more aggressive. The FBI saw the Black Power slogan as a dangerous turn towards black nationalism and separatism. They worked to discredit Carmichael, portraying him in the media as a violent, anti-white demagogue. Agents planted stories with friendly journalists, leaked information about his travel and speeches to stoke public fear, and even tried to have him charged with sedition. The FBI's goal was to isolate SNCC from its more moderate allies, from its white liberal funding sources, and from the mainstream of the civil rights movement. They used informants to create internal divisions over strategy and ideology, exacerbating the already tense debates within the organization about nonviolence, integration, and the role of white activists. The Bureau's campaign contributed significantly to the internal strife that ultimately led to SNCC's decline and dissolution by the end of the decade. The program's reach extended beyond black-led organizations to the burgeoning New Left and anti-Vietnam War movements, which were predominantly white. Groups like the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, were heavily infiltrated. The FBI saw the convergence of the anti-war and civil rights movements as a particularly grave threat, fearing the creation of a unified front against the government. They used COINTELPRO tactics to prevent coalitions from forming, spreading rumors and disinformation to create distrust between black power advocates and white student radicals. They would, for example, send anonymous letters to black activists claiming that white student leaders were patronizing and racist, while simultaneously telling white activists that black leaders were trying to exclude them. The aim was always to prevent the coalition of militant black nationalist groups, as one Hoover memo explicitly stated, and to keep these various movements fragmented, suspicious, and weak. The personal lives of individuals were also fair game, and not just for prominent leaders like Dr. King. The FBI waged a relentless and cruel campaign against the actress Jean Seberg, primarily because of her financial support for the Black Panther Party. The Los Angeles FBI office, with Hoover's direct approval, decided to neutralize her. They concocted a false and malicious rumor that the child she was pregnant with had been fathered not by her husband, but by a high-ranking member of the BPP. The Bureau then leaked this fabricated story to a gossip columnist with the Los Angeles Times, who dutifully printed it. The story was picked up by news outlets around the world. Seberg, who was in a fragile emotional state, was devastated by the public slander. She went into premature labor and gave birth to a baby girl who died 2 days later. Seberg brought the baby's body home in a glass coffin to prove to the public that it was white. She never fully recovered from the trauma, suffering from severe depression and mental health crises for the rest of her life. She died by suicide in 1979. The Seberg case is a particularly stark example of COINTELPRO's casual cruelty and its willingness to destroy individuals for political purposes. She was not a public leader or a revolutionary. She was a private citizen who used her wealth to support a cause she believed in. For this, the FBI targeted her with a lie designed to cause maximum personal anguish. A lie that contributed directly to a personal tragedy of unbearable proportions. This immense scope, from national organizations to individual donors, from black revolutionaries to white students, reveals the true nature of COINTELPRO. It was not a targeted program against a few specific threats. It was a sweeping ideological war against dissent itself. Anyone who challenged the political and racial orthodoxy of J. Edgar Hoover's America was a potential target, their life and reputation expendable in the service of maintaining order. A crucial and often overlooked pillar of the COINTELPRO strategy was the manipulation of public opinion through the mass media. J. Edgar Hoover was a master of public relations and understood innately that the war for hearts and minds was as important as any back-alley operation. He had spent decades carefully cultivating an image of the FBI as an incorruptible and heroic agency, and he used this same machinery of influence to vilify the targets of his secret programs. The Bureau did not merely react to news, it actively created it. This was achieved through a well-established network of friendly journalists, columnists, and editors at newspapers and television stations across the country. These were individuals whom the Bureau had cultivated over years, providing them with exclusive scoops, inside information on criminal cases, and flattering portrayals of the FBI's work. In return, these contacts were expected to be receptive when the Bureau wanted to plant a story. When COINTELPRO shifted its focus to the civil rights movement, this network was activated to devastating effect. Field offices were instructed to gather any derogatory information on activists, whether true, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated, and to discreetly leak it to their media contacts. The goal was to shape a public narrative that portrayed civil rights leaders as corrupt, hypocritical, and secretly controlled by communists. For example, if the FBI learned through surveillance that an organization was having an internal financial dispute, agents would leak a sensationalized version of the story to a reporter, framing it as evidence of widespread fraud and embezzlement. When Dr. King and other leaders criticized the slow pace of federal action on civil rights, the FBI would plant stories suggesting that these leaders were ungrateful radicals who unfairly attacked the very government that was trying to help them. This created a public perception that the movement was full of dangerous extremists, thereby eroding mainstream support and justifying harsh police crackdowns. Beyond leaking information, the FBI became a clandestine publisher of disinformation. COINTELPRO operations involved the creation and distribution of fake pamphlets, newsletters, and even political cartoons designed to discredit target groups and sow discord. In one of the most well-documented examples, the FBI created a fake coloring book for children. The book, supposedly published by the Black Panther Party, was filled with crude drawings depicting panthers killing police officers who were drawn as pigs. The text encouraged children to emulate this violence. The FBI then distributed these coloring books to white-owned businesses and other community stakeholders who supported the Panthers' Free Breakfast for Children program. The intent was to horrify these supporters and convince them to withdraw their funding and assistance, thereby sabotaging one of the BPP's most successful and popular community initiatives. The Bureau hoped to paint the Panthers as a group that was indoctrinating children with hate, using a publication that the Bureau itself had created. Another common tactic was the poison pen letter. Agents would forge correspondence between leaders of different groups to create animosity. A letter might be sent to a leader of a street gang, purportedly from the Black Panthers, insulting the gang's leader and challenging his authority. The hope was that this would provoke a violent and potentially lethal response. This tactic, as seen in the case of the conflict between the Panthers and the US organization in California, was shockingly effective. The Bureau was literally trying to get its targets to kill each other. These media operations were meticulously planned. Memos from the period show agents brainstorming ideas for negative cartoons, discussing which journalists were most reliable for planting a story, and assessing the impact of their disinformation campaigns. One memo from Hoover praised the imaginative and hard-hitting nature of these tactics. There was no pretense that this was related to law enforcement. It was pure propaganda and psychological warfare, funded by the American taxpayer. This manipulation of the press had a profound and lasting effect. It not only damaged the reputations of individuals and organizations, but also distorted the historical record, making it difficult for the public to understand the true nature of these movements. By controlling the narrative, the FBI was able to define its enemies in the public square, making it easier to justify the more direct and violent actions taken against them. It created a climate of fear and suspicion that made organizing incredibly difficult. Activists had to constantly worry not only about police spies in their meetings, but also about how their every word and action would be twisted and reported in the next day's newspaper. The free press, intended to be a watchdog against government overreach, was in many cases weaponized by COINTELPRO and turned into an unwitting accomplice in the state's secret war on dissent. For 15 years, COINTELPRO operated in the deepest shadows of the American government, its existence unknown to the public, the press, and even most of Congress. J. Edgar Hoover's iron grip on the FBI and the program's strict secrecy protocols ensured that this campaign of illegal harassment, disruption, and violence remained a closely guarded secret. It would take a brazen act of civil disobedience by a group of ordinary citizens to finally drag the program's dark secrets into the light of day. The date was March 8, 1971. While the nation was fixated on the fight of the century between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, a small group of anti-war activists calling themselves the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI prepared for their own momentous battle. The group, composed of 8 individuals, including a physics professor, a daycare director, and a cab driver, had spent months meticulously planning a break-in of a small residential FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania. They had cased the building for weeks, studying the routines of the agents and the layout of the office. Their leader, a Haverford College physics professor named William Davidon, believed that proving the existence of widespread government surveillance against activists required hard evidence. Speculation was not enough. They needed the government's own documents. On the night of the fight, they picked the locks and entered the unguarded office. They spent hours methodically going through every file cabinet, stuffing suitcases and bags with every document they could find. Their goal was not theft for personal gain, but exposure for the public good. They took over 1,000 documents and vanished into the night, leaving behind only a single note explaining their motives: to expose the political police nature of the FBI's work. In the days that followed, the burglars remained in hiding, poring over the stolen files. What they found exceeded their wildest suspicions. They discovered evidence of the systematic surveillance of student groups, black activists, and peace organizations in the Philadelphia area. Most critically, they found documents that were explicitly labeled with a strange and unfamiliar heading: COINTELPRO. It was the first time this codename had ever been seen outside the Bureau. The documents laid bare the program's tactics: instructions to enhance the paranoia among new left groups, to get activists fired from their jobs, and to use informants to disrupt their activities. The burglars knew they were holding bombshell evidence of a secret police force operating within the United States. Now they faced their next great challenge: getting someone to publish it. They began by anonymously mailing copies of the most damning files to select journalists and members of Congress. The initial response was discouraging. Many news organizations were wary of publishing classified government documents, fearing federal prosecution. The power and mystique of J. Edgar Hoover were still immense, and few were willing to challenge him directly. The Washington Post's Benjamin Bradley initially refused to run the story. Senator George McGovern and Congressman Parren Mitchell, both critics of the war and the FBI, were sent documents but did not immediately act. For a time, it seemed as if the burglars' incredible risk might have been for nothing. The breakthrough came with a courageous reporter at the Washington Post named Betty Metzger. She received a set of the documents and, unlike her editors, recognized their profound importance. She relentlessly lobbied her superiors, arguing that the public's right to know about these unconstitutional government activities outweighed the risks of publishing. She was persistent and persuasive. Finally, after an intense internal debate and a call from Attorney General John Mitchell demanding they return the documents, the Washington Post made the momentous decision to publish. On March 24, 1971, Metzger's first story on the stolen files appeared, revealing the existence of a secret FBI program aimed at political surveillance, Soon, other outlets like the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times followed suit. The name COINTELPRO was now public. The dam of secrecy had been broken. The initial stories created a firestorm. For the first time, there was concrete, undeniable proof of the FBI's political operations. The revelations triggered widespread outrage and calls for a congressional investigation. Although Hoover tried to downplay the significance of the program, claiming it was a discontinued and necessary measure to combat subversive groups, the damage was done. A few weeks after the initial stories, Hoover officially terminated all COINTELPRO operations, but it was too late. The media Pennsylvania break-in was the beginning of the end for the unchecked power that the FBI had wielded for decades. The identities of the burglars would remain a secret for another 40 years, but their single act of defiance set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the most significant investigation of American intelligence agencies in history, forever changing the landscape of government oversight and accountability. The secret was out. The revelations sparked by the media, Pennsylvania break-in, were like a slow-burning fuse. While J. Edgar Hoover's death in 1972 removed the program's architect from the scene, the questions raised by the stolen documents refused to disappear. The Watergate scandal, which erupted shortly thereafter, created a political climate of deep suspicion towards government secrecy and executive overreach. The press, emboldened by its role in bringing down a presidency, began to dig deeper into the history of the FBI and CIA. The trickle of information about COINTELPRO became a flood. In 1975, this culminated in the creation of the United States Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, better known as the Church Committee, named after its chairman, Senator Frank Church of Idaho. For the first time, Congress launched a full-scale public investigation into the covert activities of America's intelligence agencies. The Church Committee's investigation, which lasted for nearly 2 years, was a shocking and revelatory moment in American history. Through public hearings, witness testimony, and a review of tens of thousands of pages of classified documents, the committee systematically unearthed the full scope and depravity of COINTELPRO. The American public watched in disbelief as former FBI agents testified about forging documents, planting informants, and deliberately inciting violence. The committee's final report, issued in 1976, was a scathing indictment. It detailed the sociological warfare waged against Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., including the full story of the bugs, the smear campaigns, and the infamous suicide letter. It exposed the lethal operations against the Black Panther Party, concluding that the FBI's actions against groups like the Panthers went beyond the collection of intelligence to secret action designed to disrupt and neutralize target groups and individuals. The report confirmed that the FBI had carried out over 2,000 separate COINTELPRO actions, engaging in activities that were indisputably illegal and abhorrent in a free society. Senator Church himself summarized the findings in stark terms. The United States government has perfected a technological capability that enables us to monitor the messages that go through the air. Now, that is necessary and important to the United States as we look abroad at enemies or potential enemies. We must know at the same time that capability at any time could be turned around on the American people, and no American would have any privacy left. Such is the capability to monitor everything. I don't want to see this country ever go across the bridge. I know the capacity that is there to make tyranny total in America, and we must see to it that this agency and all agencies that possess this technology operate within the law and under proper supervision, so that we never cross over that abyss from which there is no return. The official aftermath of the Church Committee hearings was significant. COINTELPRO was officially and publicly condemned. new guidelines known as the Levi Guidelines, and later the Smith Guidelines, were established by the Attorney General to restrict the FBI's ability to investigate domestic groups, requiring a higher threshold of evidence of criminal activity before intrusive surveillance could be initiated. A permanent Senate Select Committee on Intelligence was created to provide ongoing oversight, a function that had been sorely lacking during Hoover's reign. On the surface, it appeared that the system had worked. A secret and illegal program was exposed, investigated, and shut down, with new safeguards put in place to prevent its recurrence. However, the true legacy of COINTELPRO is far more complex and enduring. The program succeeded in its primary goal, the neutralization of a generation of radical leadership. It contributed to the collapse of organizations like SNCC and the Black Panther Party. It assassinated key figures like Fred Hampton and psychologically tormented others like Martin Luther King Jr. and Gene Seberg. It sowed seeds of paranoia and distrust that poisoned the well of activism for decades. The deep-seated suspicion of government and law enforcement within communities of color and among political activists today is a direct and rational response to the historical reality of COINTELPRO. Furthermore, the question of whether the underlying mindset of COINTELPRO truly disappeared remains open. In the decades that followed, particularly in the post-9/11 era, the legal and technological framework for domestic surveillance expanded exponentially. The Patriot Act granted the government sweeping new powers to monitor citizens with far less judicial oversight than before. The rise of the internet and social media provided intelligence agencies with a vast new ocean of data to mine. Reports have emerged over the years of the FBI monitoring modern activist movements, from anti-globalization protesters to Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter. While the methods may be more sophisticated and the legal justifications different, the fundamental question raised by COINTELPRO endures. Where is the line between national security and political persecution? The unsealing of COINTELPRO's files provided a chilling answer to a question many Americans had never thought to ask. It revealed that an agency of their own government had viewed their struggle for justice not as a fulfillment of the American promise, but as a threat to be extinguished by any means necessary. The story serves as a permanent, cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked power and the fragility of liberty in the face of fear.